then summing up, I wanted to leave with just a look at some of the printed materials, some of the books that could be useful both to you as teachers as well as potential assignments for students. So the first that I want to look at are resources for teachers. I think these will help give you a pretty good look at certain case studies within this longer narrative of history. The first of which is by Piero Glejeses, here on the far right, written in 1991. His book, The Shattered Hope, is, I think, a phenomenal, in depth look at the democratic experiment in Guatemala in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and what was going on there. And it really gives a clear picture of what it looks like from within. What is the experience like from within a government that is infiltrated and overthrown by the CIA? What is that experience like? And I think that that's really important. Guatemala in general is the trigger for so many of these other events that we talk about tonight. So I think by getting a clear and in-depth understanding of that could be done with this book. I highly recommend it. Then in 2006, on the far left, I can't recommend enough Greg Grandin's Empire's Workshop: Latin America, the United States, and the Making of an Imperial Republic. This talk was originally meant as sort of a primer before Dr. Grandin's talk, a week ago. And this book is coming out with a new edition, and I could not recommend it enough. It could possibly be assigned to undergrads. It's highly readable. It is quite a page turner. This is a book that, I mean, for myself, and for the generation of scholars that I come from, this was a profoundly impactful book. It is one that charts the evolution of U.S. foreign policy in general, really, but into Latin America in particular, going from the Reagan years to about the Bush War in Iraq. And Grandin is now in his new updated edition, he's bringing us more to the present. But the idea of, what does American imperialism look like in our era? And this is, it's presented as a problem. It is presented as something that we need to confront in order to remedy. And I think that this is a great look at, where U.S. policy today in the region comes from, and it comes from, the people who wrote Reagan and later both Bush presidencies, who wrote the U.S. policy, for Latin America. Those folks are still around. They're still in Washington. They still take part in politics, and so we've really never outlived those doctrines, that era. And Greg Grandin's book is a really in-depth look at the evolution of that. In 2008, UNC's own, and the Institute for the Study of the Americas' own Luis A. Perez Jr.'s Cuba and the American Imagination: Metaphor and the Imperial Ethos is just, I think, a masterpiece. It is just a stellar look at these tropes that are projected by North Americans onto Cuba and Cubans that we're still saddled with. If you were interested during the presentation in all of the political cartoons, I highly recommend this book because it uses those cartoons as their major, as its central source. This is an amazing work because it really demonstrates where Cuban-U.S. relations come from and why they are still the way they've always been, why there's been very little traction. And I think that this is really important. And most recently, in 2019, The End of the Myth was released, also by Greg Grandin. This, I think, pairs very well with Empire's Workshop, as well as with this presentation, because Grandin tackles the myth of American exceptionalism in this book. What he really wants to get at is the idea that the United States has never had Latin America's best interests at heart. It's had its own interests at heart. Agree with that, disagree with that, either way. You can take a realpolitik view of it, but in order to understand the resentment on the part of Latin Americans toward U.S. foreign policy, it is important to tackle this issue of American exceptionalism and sort of the culture of that exceptionalism that we are still saddled with. And finally, and I would argue most importantly, what to give our students to look at, what to give our students to read, that could make learning this history both interesting and easier. I always swear by the 2016 book. The 2016 is actually the most recent version of this. There's multiple from before, of John Chastain's Born in Blood and Fire: A Concise History of Latin America. This is the one Latin America general narrative textbook that holds up in terms of being a historical monograph, and also is not ripped apart by other scholars for being too scholarly or too popular. This is a really intensely engaging, readable, chatty overview of Latin American history that takes Latin American history on its own terms. And I think that that's extremely vital. It is very well complemented by a short reader that comes with the book that is filled with primary sources. I teach sections of this book. You don't necessarily have to assign the whole thing, but it is, I think, an extremely good primer on this history we've been talking about. Another is the book Something Fierce by Carmen Aguirre, which you see here, 2014, which is a firsthand account of the daughter of two Chilean dissidents who go into exile following the rise of the Pinochet dictatorship, who eventually return after receiving revolutionary sort of military training in places like Cuba and Central America, and spend time in exile, and they return to Chile with their daughter in clandestinity in an effort to take part in the rebellion against the Pinochet dictatorship. And so this is a fascinating testament about what it was like growing up in clandestinity, what it is like to be indirectly a revolutionary, right? Being indirectly a radical, a child of radical parents, caught up in a struggle that you were born into. And I think it's a particularly powerful book. In 2017, Gregory Randall, the son of the famous poet Margaret Randall, came out with his memoir. It's a very short little book called To Have Been There Then. I could not recommend this book enough. This is the firsthand account of Gregory Randall, who grew up in revolutionary Cuba in the 1960s and the 1970s. So it's this fabulous coming of age story about what it was like, growing up in the radical 60s on the other end of the Cold War in a revolutionary society. And I think it's really valuable for high school students to see a little bit of some of the stories that they're very familiar with. Kids listening to the Beatles, they might even be able to see themselves a little bit in this. But at the same time, being on the other side, the revolutionary side of the Cold War. Gregory Randall describes his blood drives for Vietnam, his friends who were from all over Latin America and all over the third world who would, all of a sudden disappear to go into clandestinity to take part in revolutionary struggles. So this is a book that really humanizes the Cold War or revolutionary experience from the perspective of a young Latin American. And finally, the 2012 film that you see pictured here in the far right, Maestra, or Teacher, filmed by Catherine Murphy, I think is a very short, very awesome documentary film that is very teachable in a high school class. It is a collection of oral histories of women who were volunteer teachers in the Cuban literacy campaign. I think it's a very human and beautiful portrait of that it really humanizes the Cuban Revolution and shows an example of when young Latin American people were really taking part in their own destinies. And I think, if you assign one or two of these, I think they would be good tools to really give students in a high school class, even an undergrad class, something that they could see a little bit of themselves reflected. I think that's very important. Three of these books deal specifically with folks that are our students' age. And so I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that these resources are useful to you. And so thank you for tagging along with me on this fairly long presentation here. And I want to thank the Duke-UNC Consortium again and the Institute for the Study of the Americas for allowing me this time to be able to share just some of this narrative history with you. Thank you so much.